So the Transparency and Consent Framework is a tool that allows companies to communicate with each other about whether or not they have a legal basis to process personal data. And it's also, at the same time, a tool to pass that information down along the ad ecosystem. And it also allows companies to explain what they do in terms of data processing. So to do that, we've defined 5 standard purposes for data processing. And this allows a company to tell you whether or not they're processing your data and for which purpose they're doing it. And it also allows companies to tell each other not to process certain data that they don't have consent for. It's been received in a very interesting way. So initially, the key players behind building it were our members, primarily ad tech companies. DSPs, SSPs were very involved from the ground up. As we've moved on, and as the GDPR came closer, we started to see a lot more interest from publishers who realized that this was a business critical thing to get right. So we've had a lot more involvement from them. We're still kind of experiencing a bit of hurdles trying to get advertisers on board with the framework. But so far we've had a great growth so far, and we're looking to continue building on it and improving it. The e-privacy directive as it is now already requires consent for any access to devices. And the first data processing purpose that's part of our framework is simply that, access to a device and reading information. So depending on how the e-privacy regulation discussion ends up, we may need to make some small changes, but in principle, it's already there to get consent for this simple purpose. Now, if laws in the US take a similar direction to the GDPR, essentially it will depend on what we see from those laws. But in principle, the tool can be leveraged in multiple ways. And an important part is that the user interface that we surface to users is not centrally defined and can be changed except for a few small details. So it's very adaptable. At its core, it's just a technology that tells you yes or no to 1 or 2 data processing purposes. And it allows you to know whether you can go on or not. So how you define those inputs can be very easily changed after the fact, so it's adaptable to new legislation. We have seen some interesting implementations, and as I said, the user interface is largely up to publishers or consent management providers to get consent from users. The only kind of basics that we ask for is that our data processing purposes that we've defined in a standardized way are represented in the same way that we've written them out, so that everyone understands that purpose 1, 2, or 3 means exactly the same thing. So in that sense, we get a bit worried when we see, are you okay with data processing for advertising, just as a question, and then there's nothing else in the first instance. As long as it's obvious to a user where to find more information, and that extra information conforms to our kind of policies, we're usually okay with it. But it is something that is a worry, and that's why the first big thing that we're pushing now is validating all these consent management providers by building a tool to help them check that they're doing everything according to the framework. And that's kind of a first step. We're going to move forward and eventually start properly validating and taking CMPs off the list that do not comply.